For years, the world believed it knew exactly who Robin Williams was, a man of endless jokes, unstoppable energy, and laughter that filled every room he entered, but Sally Field saw something different, and while working beside him on one of the most beloved family films ever made, she witnessed moments that never reached the screen, moments of silence, instinct, and deep emotional awareness. And what she later revealed was not about comedy, but about humanity, grief, and a kindness that quietly shaped her life forever. When two worlds met on one set, when Sally Field agreed to join the cast of Mrs. Doubtfire, she was already an established and highly respected actress, and by that point in her career, she had proven herself across decades of film and television, known for her emotional discipline, professionalism, and ability to carry complex roles without exaggeration. She approached the project with a clear understanding of what it required, a grounded performance in a story that blended humor with the painful realities of divorce, custody, and fractured families, while Robin Williams, on the other hand, arrived on set carrying a very different kind of reputation. He was widely seen as unpredictable, fast-moving, and overwhelmingly energetic, and his comedic mind worked at a speed few could match. To many actors, working opposite him was intimidating, as he was known for improvising endlessly, reshaping scenes in real time, and pushing beyond the script in ways that could either elevate a moment or completely derail it, and from the beginning, the contrast between them was obvious. Field was methodical, emotionally precise, and focused on internal truth, while Williams was explosive, spontaneous, and constantly searching for new angles. Yet instead of clashing, these differences created a strange balance, and Field later reflected that working with him felt like standing inside a moving storm, unpredictable and powerful, but strangely controlled by an internal compass she would only come to understand later. Robin had a clear structure to his work that many people never noticed, as he did not arrive on set simply to improvise endlessly, and according to Field and others present, he would first deliver several takes exactly as written, respecting the script, the director, and the rhythm of the story, and only after those takes were completed would he begin to explore, which was when the unexpected voices, altered lines, and emotional shifts would emerge. Nothing was random, as it was exploration rooted in discipline, and this method forced Field to stay fully present in every scene, as she could not rely on memorized timing or predictable beats, and each take demanded genuine reaction, and over time, this sharpened her performance rather than distracting from it. So instead of competing with Williams' energy, she anchored it. Where he expanded outward, she held steady, and that contrast became the emotional backbone of their on-screen relationship. Behind the scenes, director Chris Columbus quickly recognized that what was happening between them was rare, as scenes felt alive in ways that could not be planned, and to preserve that energy, filming strategies were adjusted, and the production adapted not to chaos, but to possibility, because what mattered was capturing truth as it happened. The day the laughter stopped, halfway through production, the atmosphere on set changed in a way no one could have planned for, as they were preparing to film the courtroom sequence, one of the most emotionally charged moments in the story, which was the scene where Miranda Hillard stands before a judge explaining why she believes her children should not remain in Daniel's care. And for Sally Field, the scene already demanded restraint, control, and emotional precision. But that morning, something far heavier entered her life, as Field was sitting in her camper outside the mock courtroom when she received a phone call from a doctor, and her father, who had suffered a serious stroke years earlier and was living in a nursing facility, had just passed away after another massive stroke, and the doctor asked if she wanted resuscitation measures taken, and Field, already overwhelmed, answered immediately, saying no, because her father had been clear about his wishes, and she asked the doctor to lean down and tell him goodbye for her, and she later described herself as beside myself, but she did not break down, and like so many actors trained to work through pain, her instinct was to continue, and she intended to step onto the set and act, and she was not crying, but holding everything inside. And to the crew, she appeared composed. To the schedule, she was still available, but Robin Williams noticed something was wrong, and he did not approach her loudly or theatrically, nor did he joke, but simply watched her closely and felt the shift, and without explanation, he walked over, gently pulled her aside, and asked if she was okay. And at first, she deflected, but then she told him the truth, that her father had just died, and Williams reacted instantly, with no hesitation and no discussion about time or logistics, as he told her she needed to leave right away, and he went directly to director Chris Columbus and insisted that filming be rearranged, and scenes involving Field were delayed or shot around her for the rest of the day, because the priority was no longer the movie, it was her, and a quiet bond was forged in grief. And after that day, something fundamental shifted between Sally Field and Robin Williams, as they had already respected each other as actors, but now there was a deeper layer of trust, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, and Field returned to set carrying fresh grief, still processing the loss of her father while stepping back into a story that required emotional restraint. And what she noticed immediately was that Williams did not overwhelm her with attention or sympathy, but instead did something far more rare. He adjusted, and Robin did not push jokes in her direction, nor force conversation, but stayed aware of her emotional space, reading when she was ready to engage and when she needed distance, and when humor came, it came gently, and when silence was needed, he honored it. And Field would later describe this as one of the most compassionate forms of support she had ever experienced in her career, because he did not make her pain public, he made it safe, and their scenes together began to carry a different weight, as the arguments between Daniel and Miranda felt less performative and more lived in, and the frustration, the sadness, and the quiet resignation beneath their words came through with unusual clarity, and this was not accidental, as Field has explained that Williams' ability to listen, truly listen, made her feel emotionally anchored during scenes that could easily have tipped into melodrama, and Williams continued his disciplined approach to performance, still delivering scripted takes and still exploring through improvisation, but now Field noticed something else, that his improvisations were no longer just comedic bursts, but often emotional adjustments, pauses, softened tones, and moments of restraint that gave scenes room to breathe, as he was responding not only to the script, but to her emotional reality, and director Chris Columbus later acknowledged that the film's emotional balance depended heavily on this dynamic, because the story could have collapsed into broad comedy or turned bitter and heavy, but instead it walked a narrow line between laughter and loss, and that balance existed because Field and Williams trusted one another enough to stay honest even when the material became uncomfortable, and off-camera, their connection remained understated, as they did not socialize excessively and there were no dramatic displays of closeness, but Field has said she felt Williams's presence constantly, watchful, supportive, and aware, and he was someone who noticed when people were struggling and intervened quietly without making himself the center of the moment, and this experience changed how Field viewed him forever, because before she had admired his intelligence and talent, but after, she understood his emotional depth, and she saw that the same mind capable of creating chaos and laughter was also capable of immense sensitivity and restraint, and that Williams was not fueled by noise, but guided by instinct, revealing the side of Robin most people never saw. And after Mrs. Doubtfire wrapped, life moved forward for both of them, but the connection did not disappear, and Sally Field and Robin Williams did not become constant companions or public fixtures together, as their bond existed in a quieter space built on shared experience rather than proximity. And over the years, when Field was asked about working with Williams, her answers never focused on jokes or chaos, but instead always returned to one word: presence. And Field has consistently described Williams as one of the most emotionally intelligent people she ever worked with, because he was not simply reacting to lines or blocking, but reacting to people, and on set, he paid attention to the emotional temperature of a room, noticing who was anxious, who was tired, who was struggling, and when he intervened, he did so without performance, as there was no audience for his kindness, and this stood in contrast to how the public largely understood him, because to audiences, Williams was speed, volume, and excess, a torrent of voices and characters, but Field saw that this external energy masked something far more delicate, as beneath the improvisation was a man constantly scanning for emotional signals, adjusting himself to protect others from discomfort or pain, and as the years passed, Field became increasingly aware that this side of Williams was disappearing from the public narrative, as interviews focused on his brilliance, his chaos, and his rapid-fire humor, while rarely did anyone ask about the cost of that generosity or the emotional labor required to constantly lift others, and Field did not correct this image publicly at first, choosing instead to hold those memories privately. And when Williams died, the shock was global, but for Field, it was deeply personal, and she did not immediately speak in detail, but when she did, her words carried weight because they were restrained, as she described him not as broken, but as brave, not as unstable, but as deeply feeling, and she emphasized that his kindness was not accidental, but intentional, instinctive, and constant, the kindness that hit a quiet collapse. And in the years leading up to his death, Robin Williams was living in a state of growing confusion and fear that very few people fully understood at the time, as from the outside, it appeared as if he was simply struggling with depression again, something he had spoken about publicly in the past, but those closest to him sensed that something else was happening, something more severe, more destabilizing, and harder to explain. And professionally, his momentum had slowed, as a television project he had hoped would mark a strong return failed to gain traction and was cancelled after a single season. And for a performer who had spent decades relying on instinct, speed, and mental sharpness, this felt like a door quietly closing, and at the same time, he was navigating personal transitions, including the emotional aftermath of divorce and the effort to settle into a new marriage, and these changes alone would have been heavy, but combined, they became overwhelming, and then came a diagnosis that frightened him deeply, as he was told he had Parkinson's disease, and the possibility of losing control over his movement, speech, and memory struck at the core of his identity, because Robin Williams' life and career were built on timing, agility, and mental clarity, and the thought of those abilities slipping away filled him with anxiety, and his friends later recalled him becoming more withdrawn, more uncertain, and increasingly afraid of his own mind, and what no one knew at the time was that this diagnosis was incomplete, because after his death, an autopsy revealed that Williams had been suffering from Lewy body dementia, a severe and aggressive neurological disorder, and the disease causes unpredictable cognitive decline, intense anxiety, confusion, hallucinations, and sudden changes in mood and behavior, and it is often misdiagnosed because symptoms overlap with other conditions and it progresses rapidly, and for someone like Williams, the experience was devastating, as he was losing access to the very instincts that had guided him his entire life, and the man who could read a room and sense emotional shifts in others with extraordinary accuracy was suddenly unable to trust his own perceptions, and friends described him as frightened by his own thoughts, aware that something was wrong, but unable to name it, and Sally Field has never claimed to have known what he was going through in those final years, but what she has said is more restrained and more honest, as she has expressed sorrow not just for the loss itself, but for the fact that he did not get to grow old alongside his peers, and she has spoken about how deeply unfair it feels that someone so generous, so attuned to the pain of others, was left to navigate such confusion largely in silence, and the memory she chose to carry for him years after Mrs. Doubtfire had become a permanent part of popular culture remained powerful, as Sally Field stood on a red carpet preparing to receive one of the highest honors of her career, being celebrated for a lifetime of work, decades of performances, and her place among Hollywood's surviving legends, but before she spoke about herself, she without second